Is it better now? Yep, great. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion, Balance of Interests, Keeping Decarbonisation on Course Through the Energy Crisis. With G7 heads of state in Elmau, with EU energy ministers in Luxembourg, or at least on their way, and environment ministers meeting tomorrow, it feels like it couldn't be a more timely moment to explore this particular tension that the EU is facing around the energy question and the challenge of keeping the climate agenda on board through it. My name is Susie Dennison. I'm the director of the European Power Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we're really pleased to be collaborating with the European Investment Bank on this event this morning, with both the Paris and Berlin offices. Unfortunately for you, due to various constraints, travel, illness, and so on, you'll be seeing a lot more of me this morning than was planned in terms of moderation. But I hope you'll still feel at the end of the discussion that for those of you who are in the room, that it's great to be able to do this in person. And we're very pleased as well to have those who are joining us remotely by live stream too. So, without further ado, I would like to hand over for our keynote remarks from Ambroise Fayol, the Vice President of EIB, former Chief Executive of Agence France Trésor, Ministry of Finance of France. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here this morning. As you say, it's better to do things in person now that we can do it. Thanks very much for having me here at this event. Energy security is clearly one of the most urgent challenges that Europe faces today. This policy discussion comes at a moment of great uncertainty, human suffering and concerns. Russian invasion of Ukraine has plunged Europe into its biggest security emergency and refugee crisis since World War II. Here in Europe, the war has made the need to protect our sovereignty and autonomy more urgent than ever. But the great opportunity amid the tragedy of war is that the bold investments needed to become independent from Russian fossil fuels will help us solve these biggest long-term problems facing humanity, which is climate change. At the beginning of the year, the global economy was showing signs of recovery from COVID-19. Now, the war in Ukraine creates a new massive shock. It has deep implications in global economy, particularly for energy security. Before the Russian invasion, the outlook in the EU was that we would progressively replace fossil fuel by 2050. This would be done through the sustained expansion of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electrification of end users. The EU itself has set very ambitious targets for 2030. At the same time, it was already considered a major challenge. And today, this remains doable. But the war in Ukraine has made it more difficult. Russia's gradual shutdown of natural gas supply could lead to a significant gap between supply and demand of energy. And in this context, the diversification of gas supplies provides one part of the answer to this challenge, but only one part. The European Commission made it very clear in a very important paper that they published last month, the Repower EU plan, that the long-term solution to our energy supply problems is to scale up and accelerate our investments in renewable energy for electricity and heat. It also goes through a drastic increase in energy efficiency measures in existing buildings and industry. The invasion of Ukraine has forced us to rethink our energy and climate policy. We must accelerate the green transition, not slow it down. This is a strong belief that we had at EIB. This is crucial for EU security, including in France. The geopolitical rationale for doing so overlaps with the imperative to tackle climate change. And in any case, as said clearly in the latest IPCC report on mitigation, we have no choice. GHG emissions must peak in the next 3 years if we want to keep the 1.5 degree target alive. And that being said, in this transition, we must avoid replacing existing problems with other ones. And actually, there are two important aspects to this. One, as critical as the search for alternative suppliers of natural gas may be in the short term, it should not lock us into a new long-term dependence on fossil fuel. That would be costly and catastrophic for the planet. It would be unnecessary given the clean energy options that are available. And two, we must not trade off one bottleneck for another. We should not swap our over-dependence on fossil fuel for another dependence on raw materials. Today, these resources are heavily concentrated in a handful of countries, not all of them having the same values as in the European Union. So strengthening our strategic autonomy and resilience must remain a key objective of the transition. This accelerated transition will have also deeper social and economic impacts than foreseen when the Fit for 55 package was negotiated. We must manage it carefully and collectively across the EU to make sure we leave no one behind. This is the concept of the just transition. To be successful, the transition must be accepted. And to be accepted, it must be just. So there is an important point in the paper that is released today by the European Council on Foreign Relations that says we should establish broad guidelines on managing the socio-economic consequences of the European Green Deal. And this is true. We should avoid disparate approaches on this delicate question. To address this challenge, as foreseen in the REPower EU plan, the EU member states will need to borrow further to finance investments in rapidly scaling up the clean energy industry. This is where an institution like the European Investment Bank, the Bank of the European Union, can step in. Delivering the REPower EU objectives requires an additional investment of around 30 billion euros until 2030. Accelerating green transition means, first and foremost, constructing green energy infrastructure for solar and wind energy, power grids, storage facilities and energy terminals that can later also be used for green hydrogen. The entire European Union is facing the challenge. As the European Council of Foreign Relations papers say, we should act, therefore, together. A united European Union has greater purchasing power with suppliers. All EU countries would also benefit from greater connectivity in their power grids, so that wind power, for example, can be imported during lulls in certain regions. We saw yet another advantage of the connectivity just a few years ago, when Russia cut the supply to Finland, which was able to cope with the shortfall thanks to imports from Estonia and Sweden. Europeans should also massively invest in energy efficiency, combining subsidy programs with loans from development banks. But the scale of the investment requires far more than what governments and public authorities can and should provide. The private sector and capital markets needs to play a key role, and here EIB can help by helping to harness the power of capital markets. And let me say what we do at EIB. We have set very ambitious targets in the Bank of the European Union to increase massively the share of what we finance in climate action. We land year on year between 60 and 70 billion euros, mostly in Europe. We intend to increase the share of what we finance for climate and environment to 50% by 2025, which means that we would finance basically something like 30 billion euros in 2025 and beyond. And that, we hope, will help other investors, and especially private investors, to join us in what we say crowding in investment in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in innovation for climate, because we all know that if we want to reach the climate targets, there are innovations that are not yet available and that we need. But we also know that we need to, and we borrow to land. So actually we are also very active in the green market. We were the first institution in 2007 to issue what that time was called the climate awareness bond, which has quite an interesting meaning, the climate awareness bonds, which is a green bond. And since then, we are also issuing sustainability awareness bonds for our bonds that we issue, for example, for education or for water. And one of our strengths, and actually Emmanuel is here to testify of this, we don't employ only bankers, we are a bank of engineers, actually. And we have engineers, we have biologists who can judge which projects and technologies are promising, including from an environmental perspective, and that's what we do in applying our standards. When we finance a project, we hope, and that's what we see, other financiers come on board. And a good example is the development of floating wind farms. When you look at the history of wind farms, 20 years ago, we were financing onshore wind farms in Europe. And it happens to us to do that, but almost not anymore, because private sector can do that, and that's great. We are a public bank. If the public bank is not needed, then let's have the private sector play its role. We've moved 10 years ago to finance to finance offshore wind farms, so farms that are on sea. And that was at the time technically more complicated and risky, and this is where also an institution like EIB was needed, and we continue to finance these projects, especially when they are of very high scale or huge financing are required. But where we are more useful now is to finance floating offshore. That is basically when we can supply, even when in countries with steeply sloping coast, and without having a base load power plants. And that is something that is extremely promising. What we estimate is once the technology can be used at an industrial scale, it can produce much more electricity than it consumes today worldwide. We have already developed a project in Portugal, in France, in Spain, and this is, to me, very, very promising as a technology. In the capital market too, we can see development in the right direction. Today, in 2021, there was green bonds in excess of 600 billion euros that were issued. Social bond issuance jumps to 210 billion euros last year. And sustainability bonds reached 190 billion euros of new issuance last year. This means that there are investors willing to buy these bonds, and there are investments that can attract this kind of financing. Sustainable finance in general, not only on the funding side, has finally moved to the center of the stage, and actually with great thanks to the role of the central banks, in particular the European Central Bank. We have seen important developments lately in terms of tools, standards, metrics, beyond green bond standards. The adoption of the EU taxonomy, for example, gives us a common language to define what is green. And actually, this is the purpose of the taxonomy. Whatever you can say about the current debate on taxonomy, it's very important that investors have confidence on assessing what is green and what is not. And this is what actually is the purpose of the taxonomy. And also to track the use of the proceeds from the green bond issuances. The work on the international platform on sustainable finance that focused on finding common ground between different taxonomies with other jurisdictions, including with China or Japan. The formation of a new international sustainability standard board that will contribute to streamlining and formalizing corporate sustainability disclosure globally. And the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that was launched in Glasgow, where private sector has committed to 130 trillion worth of assets to net zero. So there are a lot of things that are happening in this front, and that's why I remain optimistic despite the difficult environment that we are in. The ECFR paper rightly states that the EU member states should have a coordinated approach to energy and solidarity policies. The same is true at international level. Increasing the EU's autonomy does not mean that we should isolate ourselves. We cannot do this alone. Russia's war has strengthened the rationale for all the countries to reduce their fossil fuel imports. It has reinforced the case for everyone to invest more in climate-friendly energy solutions. This is why the EU is actively engaged in climate diplomacy. We want to encourage others to raise their green ambitions. Through the European Green Deal and the new Global Gateway Initiative, EU institutions and member states are mobilizing up to 300 billion euros of investment. This will target green and digital infrastructure to address the climate, biodiversity, and energy crisis outside of Europe, and in particular in Africa. And we have created a new arm for that at EIB, with a new development arm, which is called EIB Global, which is working with partners around the world to mobilize finance for energy efficiency, renewables, and electricity grid projects. So in conclusion, I would simply say that I agree with you, Susie, that we need a common EU narrative on decarbonisation, one that is based on a collective approach to building a new kind of energy security. Indeed, we need a European approach on this, and the EIB stands ready to support it. We need to be able not only to maintain EU's climate ambition, but convince others to raise theirs. We are well aware that none of this will be easy in a political climate in which citizens are fearful about the economy, the cost of living, and their basic security. But together, we Europeans can accomplish a great deal to become independent from Russian oil and gas and to slow down climate change. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those very comprehensive comments, not only on the EIB's approach, but lots of challenges for us to dig into in the following discussion. And I'm also very grateful for you for kicking us off with a note of optimism that there are ways forward through this, because I think it's very easy for us to get lost in the level of challenge at the moment, given the geopolitical situation. I know that you have to leave at some point soon. We understand that, so you should feel free to slip out when you need to. I also want to flag that we're benefiting from further expertise from the EIB later on in the panel discussion and also in the room. So I'm sure that if there are questions for Mr. Fayol, they can be picked up as we proceed through the morning. I'm now going to change my hat and move from a moderating role to presenting just a few thoughts from the paper which Mr. Fayol kindly referred to that we're launching today at ECFR. It's called Green Peace, with a space between the green and the peace, just so we don't get into any trademark issues. How Europe's climate policy can survive the war in Ukraine. I just wanted to share with you as a further injection of food for thought for our discussion, some of the findings that we're highlighting there. So our starting point was that obviously EU member states are struggling with a common problem at the moment. On the one hand, the fraught geopolitical environment. On the other hand, the need for a robust response to Russia, the war in Ukraine, including a sanctions package which covers energy. And on a third hand, if you've got one left, the need for keeping implementation of the Fit for 55 package moving forward. And these three factors, with varying degrees, are all pushing energy prices up in the near term. We're currently seeing from member states a certain level of division, a range of different responses around how to handle that trilemma, as one might call it. And they tend to be quite nationally led at the moment. On the one hand, we're seeing a number of countries extending the life of coal-fired power plants. We're seeing the exploration of new forms of infrastructure to import LNG. We're also seeing the exploration of new external partnerships, gas partnerships with third countries, and you know, primarily, I think what we're seeing is a lack of coordination, if you like, around that, a lack of common narrative. So this is why at ECFR we decided to dig into this question, working with our network of associate researchers in the 27 member states earlier this spring, to explore the way that different national capitals are looking at this question, and where they think the balance is, whether or not you can do both, transition away from dependence on Russia for energy at the same time as transitioning towards decarbonisation. And the sort of the principal research input that has gone into this work is therefore interviews with policymakers and analysts in the 27 capitals. And the findings from that process were quite interesting, because obviously it exposed the divisions between member states that have long been there, in terms of a group of climate progressives, if you will, which is not new, and we've seen sort of new evidence of in a letter to the EU institutions a couple of weeks back from them, concerned about the Fit for 55 package and the sort of lack of commitment there. So this is essentially the Nordics plus, if you like, in terms of a grouping. But we also identified through this process 3 other division-like fault lines, if you like, in Europe at the moment. One is around the role of further energy sanctions in response to Russia. I think we're all very well aware that with the 6th sanctions package, European states probably got to the limits of consensus around how far they were willing to go on this front. And that issue and the sort of the tensions around that and the feeling of what happens next on that front is obviously feeding through into the possibility of cooperation around other issues on this dossier at the moment. I think we're certainly not at the point of an impasse, but there are sort of warning signs of the ability to go further. The second newer fault line, if you like, is around the definition of clean energy. And Mr. Fayola's alluded to this in the discussions on the taxonomy proposal. Clearly, I think this is probably well known to many of you, one of the key issues here is around the inclusion of nuclear and gas in the definition of green energy for investment. And that has also sort of thrown up some tensions which will play through into cooperation going further. But then a third fault line, if you like, that I would like to highlight from this work is the way in which member states are viewing the need for domestic response on the socio-economic consequences of rising energy prices. Sort of in short, the willingness to go for a subsidisation model. And we're seeing some quite high-profile cases of member states going down that route at the moment, but also the extent to which this subsidisation is perceived as being something that we can do long-term. But there's also, at a political level, a school of thought that is much more around the idea of the need for an honest narrative and accepting that this can only ever be a short-term response, and there is a need for businesses and consumers to be able to plan. So I think that there is a certain concern in many member states that you can't have these different approaches existing side by side in a close union, because if on the one hand one domestic audience is being sort of fed a more honest narrative, on the other hand they will then ask the question, why do our neighbours 50 kilometres away have a different approach? So there's a sort of a clear case for thinking this through collectively on this front. But the final point, which I would link to this third division group, is around the role of borrowing in this subsidisation. We haven't yet seen, I would argue, on the energy crisis, the sort of whatever it takes moment that we saw around the need for investment on the COVID response 2 summers ago. And I think that is a sort of a coming decision for the EU. The extent to which the old division between creditor and debtor states when it comes to the European budget might feed through into this climate question around the financing mechanism. So here I thought that the comments from the EIB vice presidents were very interesting on the thinking from the EIB point of view on that front. What I argue in the paper that we're launching today is that all this sort of bolsters the case for an understanding of the current challenge as a European challenge. That essentially it's a Europe-sized problem which needs a Europe-sized response. To some extent, there is, this was a specific question that we asked of our researchers, there is a sense that the EU institutions are doing a good job of coordinating EU efforts at the moment. Although there was some sort of mixture of views on this which tend to align with the relationship of that country with Europe more generally. So you saw a certain scepticism of the role of the EU institutions in Bulgaria, which is traditionally more Eurosceptic, whereas in Portugal you saw reported very, very strong coverage of the role that the EU institutions are playing in terms of responding to the crisis. Interestingly, some member states, we heard this in Italy, are quite critical of insufficient engagement on the external dimension of managing the energy crisis and building up a diplomatic strategy to underpin this. But generally speaking, a sense that in a coordination role, the picture is positive. But coming back to the narrative point, which was raised by our previous speaker, I think that there is a clear space for the larger member states to play a role in driving this discussion forward. We asked a typically cheeky question, as we like to do at ECFR, on whether or not the policymakers surveyed felt that Germany was a climate leader or that France was a climate leader. We got the response from 60% of the countries, the 27 states, that they do see Germany as a climate leader, and 50% that France was. But if you dig a little bit underneath this picture, there was a clear frustration at the lack of clear messaging on where the right balance lies between the clean energy transition and security of supply from the German government. That there was a certain level of expectation 6 months ago from a coalition government coming in with the Green Party as part of that, that is currently not being met. A sense that pragmatism rather than thought leadership characterises the decision-making around this. Some of the examples that came through were the ability to innovate when it came to the regulatory reform package to build new LNG terminals in Germany, taking months rather than years, but a certain sort of tension with that, given the whole taxonomy discussion. Also a sense of the unpredictability, actually, that came with this from the German government's behaviour, that as a partner on this, it was less clear how and where you could work with them on this narrative question. Also came through a sense of industry rather than consumer focus perceived by particularly the smaller member states. Portugal and Cyprus noted this on the German government's approach. And then a nervousness. Again, I think I would underline that this is about what could potentially come rather than conversations that are already taking place, about Germany's continued alignment with fiscally conservative states, and a worry that will mean that the necessary financing for what is foreseen in the Repower EU plan, that the financing won't be forthcoming. So what does this mean for France, where we are now, and which is just coming to the end of its presidency? I would argue that there is a real opportunity that we can see in the data from this work in terms of France's climate leadership, if you will. Obviously, France is starting from something of a tricky place on this. There's a strong identification from the taxonomy discussions with France as being very driven by national interests around the nuclear energy question. This was particularly reported from Germany and the Netherlands. But what is interesting is, I think, is the alliances that France has through this process. Some of the states that sort of judge themselves as aligning with France on this point: Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, also Slovenia and Estonia. This group builds across some of the other divisions that I was highlighting earlier. And so on one level, we can see that there is the opportunity to use that like-mindedness around this energy question to push through with some of these member states which are less motivated on other aspects of the Fit for 55 package to push through the implementation there. For example, on the need for immediate investment in the development of clean security. A lot of these member states have very pressing immediate concerns about their current energy security, but you know, so I think that the financing question, the support for making clean energy apart from that, is particularly important in those countries. And then coming back to this sort of this idea of France as a sort of a bridge between budget contributors and net recipients, and the difference here between the possibility for Germany to play leadership on this front. The idea of a collective financing approach could be something that France could champion. I would highlight, though, I mean, obviously I think this report is worth a read because I've been spending a lot of time on it, but I think that there's a lot of interesting material in there as well on the practical level collaboration that's going on between other member states in terms of intra-EU projects. Lots of interesting examples, but we saw particularly Denmark, Spain, Poland and Sweden coming through as some of the more active member states on this front after France and Germany, often including public and private partnerships around this. So how would I argue France should take this challenge forward? I mean, France is the home, the intellectual home, if you like, of the idea of sovereignty. And it seems to me that this challenge that we're facing at the moment is very much one of climate and energy sovereignty, and the two things coming together. So I would argue that that framing makes it quite a natural mantle for Paris to take up as it moves forward from the presidency. And I think that there is a lot of partnership potential there with some of these other states that I have mentioned. This is really not about ideas about what to do, but a change of mindset about the framing to avoid the perpetuation of national level responses, thinking of this as at a European level, thinking of this as energy and climate sovereignty together, and really a next phase energy and climate union is what seems can help us make the right choices for the longer term to avoid being locked into energy choices which go against our climate objectives. And also, just at a very practical level, being able to secure the best deals for at an economic level for Europe. So I will stop there because I think that's enough self-promotion from the chair. And I'm now going to invite Kevin Macron to come and join us on the panel. Kevin Macron is the former diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Ecological Transition in France, Varma. And he's kindly agreed to join us today for what I've termed a fireside chat to talk to us about the role of the French presidency. So thank you very much, Kevin, for stepping in at a very short notice. I wondered if you would be willing just to reflect, we're obviously now days away from the end of the French presidency. What do you see as the central achievements around this agenda from a Paris point of view?
Well, thank you, Susie. And I think you said already many things. I don't know if the microphone is working. Is it?
I think it is working, is it?
It is? No, it's not. Okay. Okay, now it's working. I think you said, Ambroise Fayol and yourself said already quite a lot of things, but after being 2 years with the ex-Minister of Ecological Transition, what I saw is that the ecological transition was very unevenly understood inside the European Union. And although several years ago there were still a lot of divides over this comprehension and the targets, what I experienced when we started the French presidency a couple of months ago, is that there was no discussion anymore among member states on these very targets. I mean, the end game and the whole package of the Green Deal. Of course, the pathways are very different and the interests are very different and are being discussed. I hope today at the Council in Luxembourg and tomorrow we can actually reach a common position from the Council on several important issues. But there is, although it's unevenly understood, there's a common understanding of the challenge ahead and the urgency. And what we've been trying to do for the French presidency is to take this package as far as we could in a very coherent manner, in a comprehensive manner, because inside the Fit for 55 package, and I know you're probably very well aware of all the different directives and texts inside of it, it's a coherent package, and you cannot slice it down and make it in little bits and pieces. When you actually negotiate the CBAM, and the ECOFIN actually gave a common position in March on that, you cannot not negotiate at the same time the ETS system and the free allowances of the allowances of free emission. I think what we were able to do is to try to give a momentum, to keep this package a coherent package and a comprehensive package, and to show, I think, the Ukrainian crisis and war, as Ambroise Fayol said, is a watershed moment for our security architecture as much as for our energy policies. And we're living a very important moment for energy policies inside the European Union that show that sovereignty is probably the only key for the European Union to go forward, and that this tension that you have mentioned, Susie, between our climate goals and energy supplies and security shows that we have to push as fast as possible and accelerate on this transition. Now, this is not an easy task, and for many countries inside the European Union, it means massive investment, massive support, a lot of social engineering, I think. It's the same across the world. I mean, we were in South Africa for the JET contract, the Just Energy Transition, with South Africa with the minister a couple of months ago, and the main problem there is exactly the same as probably you would have in Czech Republic for energy efficiency on buildings. You know, it's the social engineering behind it. It's the economics behind it. So I'm not sure whether we would succeed in everything, but I think we've been trying to show leadership to push that package as fast as possible, and to show with our partners. I think of the IEA, with which we've been working quite a lot, financial partners as well. I mean, are extremely important for making this investment in clean energy in the future, in building, in transport, and we've been trying to push that package as much as we could, and obviously bridging over the different interests and the different difficulties of the member states. It's not always easy, but I think, as COVID shown, the Ukrainian crisis was another way of making us understanding that we have to work towards this direction. I think that's more or less my impressions, but it's very impressionist. But
Thank with the external dimension since you finished there, and particularly the role of climate financing in the current international debate around this picture. We've heard many reactions from outside Europe to the agreement on CBAM that you referred to, and the role that financing generated through that source will play in the climate financing package going forward, and sort of concerns from the African side that this is essentially about other countries paying for their own climate financing. What is your sense on whether, given the massive constraints within within Europe and the need for massive investment within Europe, that there is a constructive way forward on this dialogue around climate financing as we head up to COP27?
Well, I think it's not going to be an easy way. I mean, you can see now the discussions are very intense in Bonn on several financial issues before Sharm el-Sheikh. And you understand that Africa will need a massive amount of finance also to make that transition. I think the European Union is working on it very well. There will need to be capacity transfer as well. And I think we all know that we cannot keep that transition just up north, and that the European Union can go as fast as it can. But if other part of the world are not transitioning themselves and are not financed, it's going to be difficult. And that's why the just energy transition contracts are very interesting in this respect. I think they help also other countries like India, like Indonesia, big emitters. That will be crucial to peak our GHG emission in 2025 or a little bit later, if we cannot afford that. And investment will be massively needed there. And so I think we have to find also other formats and other ways of collaborating with these countries. And investing in these countries to help them transition to electrical vehicle, to renewables, obviously. Energy efficiency, another topic which is very unevenly understood and acknowledged across the world, is obviously energy efficiency. And I know that recently the IEA had this meeting in Denmark where it actually highlighted the fact that energy efficiency was probably one of the quickest way to stop this dependency, especially for the European Union towards Russia. So there are a lot of money needed, but as Ambroise Fayol said, I think the private sector has also a very important role to play. We know we have now new rules on corporate sustainability reporting coming in by the European Union. There is also a very interesting alliance that was mentioned after the Glasgow Pact, and the financial system is shifting progressively. But we will need security also for private actors and investors, and that's where the taxonomy comes in as well. So all in all, I would say we're embarked on a journey which is fascinating, but at the same time very scary in terms of pace. We know that 2030 is also a very important milestone, and 2030 is actually in 8 years, and we're going to need to find more collaborative way of acting together, not only inside the European Union but outside as well. G7, G20 are very important for that. And beyond. I'm thinking of the loss and damage issue, for instance, at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. We can see that the Global South is also asking for answers, for investments, for compensation, also for all the and to have more climate resilience for the future, because it will cost a lot more in the future than if we invest now with them on their capacity, on green resilience of cities, of the electrical system there, and that's very important, I think.
Thank you. And I can't resist asking, once everybody's had a good rest after July the 1st, what do you see within Europe as being the sort of role that France might play in cooperation with institutions and other member states around this agenda? Do you see this with the other two priorities of the French presidency continuing to be something that we can expect the government to be very focused on?
Well, there's a broader question, including a national question, I think. But if I remind well, the president during the two-turn of the election said France will be an ecological nation or won't be. And I think the ambition is also for the European Union showing that leadership and building that sovereignty agenda. And that's what we're doing, also trying to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels coming from Russia, on fossil fuels overall. And I think that's the ambition of continuing to push the agenda in Europe, helping other member states as well, the Czech now, that will be coming in. With the trio of presidency, we've been trying to link as much as possible our work and our ambitions. I think it's one of our now. If you look, for instance, you know I always remember the ETS system and the way we've been pushing for this for the last 20 years, probably, and the CBAM as well. And it showed that this idea of sovereignty in Europe, of energy sovereignty, but more generally speaking, also to try to keep our industry in Europe, to try to decarbonize with establishing also a level playing field, a green level playing field across the board, also without carbon leakage, has been already the idea that was there. Germany for quite a long time, and now I think we see that the moment is probably arrived where it's time to do it concretely. It will be long and difficult, but I think this package, for instance, the Fit for 55 package, it's a good answer to it. So.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just ask if there's anybody else in the room that would like to raise any questions or comments at this point on anything that's been discussed. Or maybe perhaps while you're reflecting, a question that I have I would be interested in views from either of those of you here on the panel is Kevin, you in particular mentioned the role that we're increasingly seeing of the G7 and the G20 outside the formal UN architecture on climate, if you like, playing on this agenda at the moment. And there is strong anticipation that the G7 will send a message on the use of climate clubs in this environment. Do you see a sort of a twin track approach emerging in terms of the way, given the interconnectedness between the climate and energy agendas, which was always there but is perhaps more acutely felt now? Do you see this as being a complementary process, or do you see there being risks around the COP process for this transition?
Well, I can see I've got the hardest questions this morning. So, I mean, carbon pricing is extremely important. What we're trying to do now inside the European Union is to give the proper price to carbon and to move forwards. For too long, I think European industries were paying the carbon price on a too little share of their production, and that's still the case in many countries in the world. Now, harmonizing this market is obviously a very difficult thing to do. I think they're enthusiastic. We can be quite enthusiastic when we see that the US now is launching a bill on the carbon price. There are many work being done at the IMF, at the OECD on carbon pricing, and obviously we'll need to end up with a carbon price that reflects the cost on the environment of the production of electricity, of transportation, so on and so forth. Now, this path will not be linear, and I think the ambition of the European Union is to become the first continent precisely to have a carbon that reflects that cost, and for it to be completely internalized in our process, our production processes, on our energy consumption, on our transports. That's extremely important, and I hope that we'll be able to work more and more with all our partners, including China, which is a very important one as well, of course, and big emitters, to make sure that step by step we reach that level of a carbon price that is evenly distributed on social groups, on private sectors, and on countries. But it's obviously a tremendous challenge, and in this respect, the EU is kind of a laboratory, as it was always. But I think now more than ever, we can see that it's a bit like COVID. You never have the right answer at the moment, and you have to make tries and errors. But it moves forward, so I'm very happy with that.
Thank you. Did you want to comment on this?
Just to give you the way we approach that at EIB, that question. When we assess a project, we assess whether a project is going to be profitable from a financial point of view, as all banks, but also from a social and environmental standards. And that's what makes us different from many other financial institutions. And in assessing the environmental part, what we do is we use an internal price of carbon in assessing our projects. And to give you an idea, these are not price of carbons, but you'll see the magnitude of the change. We had the price of carbon in our projects that was 80 euro per ton last year. It's going to be 250 euro per ton in 2030 and 800 euro in 2050. And of course, this has implications about projects that are to be financed, or that projects that were not financeable before, and conversely. And we do that with the objective to be consistent with what you said, Kevin, about the objective of having climate neutrality by 2050. That's the way that we have, and we review every year this internal price of carbon to see if recent developments of what we know about recent reports from science, etc., makes it still consistent with our objective. So that's also a way that internally institutions can help developing a price of carbon.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Okay. Well then, right on time, I think I'm going to draw this session to a close, and thank very much both Ambroise Fayol and Kevin Macron for joining this discussion this morning. And we're going to transition now into a policy workshop, so I'm going to invite some other colleagues currently on the floor to join me. But thank you very much indeed. But I'm very pleased now to be joined, in fact, in the order in which they're sitting, by Manuel Barreto, the senior economist from the EIB Energy Projects Directorate, Oliver Luanzi, partner from the strategy unit at PricewaterhouseCoopers, not quite the right order, Lola Vallejo, the climate program director at IDRI, and Thomas Pellerin-Carlin from the Jacques Delors Energy Centre. He's the director there. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. What we wanted to do now is to take the discussion into a forward-looking one, trying to develop an action plan for the new French government and for the EU looking forward. What I'm hoping is that we're going to hear some quite different perspectives on that from our speakers, who are obviously from a range of backgrounds. But maybe I could start off by asking Thomas, if that's okay, because you're closest to me, to comment on what for you has been missing from the discussion so far in terms of what you see as the way forward through balancing this challenge going forward. The floor is yours.
So does this mic?
Yes, that sounds
well, I think it has been missing a narrative and an actual strategy. So missing a lot. So since the beginning of the second invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, there was this narrative of, we should forget about climate. This has been pushed, unsurprisingly, by people that didn't care about climate before and didn't care about climate after that. I think if we want to take that seriously, let's just think, just create an alternative reality where we actually cared about climate from, 2008. Let's not go beyond that. If France had implemented its building renovation strategy adopted in 2008, adopted by Nicolas Sarkozy, a conservative politician, so nothing, tremendously ambitious, France would have saved an amount of energy that is more than the amount of energy that it imports from Russia. That's a similar thing that could have happened in other countries. If we collectively had put in place the regulatory framework and financial framework in order to renovate buildings. Here again, nothing revolutionary, just implementing the modest, unambitious plans. We would already be much less dependent from Russia. So to me, 95% of what we need to do for energy security is also good for climate and vice versa. And obviously we can bicker around the 5% remaining that has to do with LNG, Algerian gas and coal. But essentially 95% of what we need to do for climate is also good for national security and vice versa. Then when it comes with a strategy is having a strategy on different pillars that articulate the long term and the short term. To me those pillars are threefold: sufficiency, efficiency, and decarbonized energy. And if we look at them, try to see where we need to go, where we need to be by 2050, and what can actually help now to both get there in 2050, but also to be part of the solution to the what may become the worst energy crisis in Europe since 1945. I want to start with energy sufficiency because that's the big element that has been missing in the debate. Energy sufficiency is about reducing our demand for energy services by actually, reducing energy demand by reducing what we expect from the energy system. To give a very, very practical example, I came here today and I was feeling cold because the conditioning was on. And so I have my thermometer that I always carry with me since February the 24th. And it's a small one. It was 19 Celsius degree in that room. So we were using gas to generate electrons that would later cool down this room at a temperature that I think was actually fine for men like me with a jacket made of wool, but for most people, it's not that comfortable. I use that example because that's going to be one concrete element that can be done this summer. The more or the less we ask to cool anything, but especially rooms, The more electricity we save, the more electricity we save, the more gas we save. The more gas we save now, the more gas we may have in the winter on, I don't know, February 12th, for instance, where we might actually be needing it. So that's very short-term, but that's the kind of short-term changes that can have not only short-term, but a long-term impact. I mean, maybe at some point a society would recognize that the right temperature in the winter is, maximum 18 Celsius degrees. I've tried 16, works well, but, just for the sake of having a margin for maneuver, let's say 18 Celsius degrees in the winter, and in the summer, I don't know, 28 in most places, 25 in hospitals, but not a freezing 19 Celsius degrees. If we do that, I mean, the savings that we have are quite massive. I mean, they are in the range of several percentage of the entire energy demand of the European Union. I didn't make the calculation, but as a rough estimate, I would be surprised if it's below than 5%, which is already quite significant. Those kind of sufficiency also reduces the demand for investments, because if we accept that 18 Celsius degrees is the right temperature in the winter, we can have an energy system, energy infrastructure that is tailored to deliver that. So that means reducing electricity demand today and in the medium term also means that we will have less investment to do in generation facilities, in building electricity networks, all those elements. So sufficiency is not only good for the environment, it's also good to reduce the cost of the energy system. The second thing has to do with efficiency. So efficiency is we deliver the same energy service, but just we make it better. And here, I mean, there is no short-term fix. I mean, there are one or two things, like you can check the water heating system to make sure that the water is not heated beyond 60 Celsius degrees. But apart from that, the short-term gains are very, very shallow. So it's more medium-term and the long-term perspective, and that requires actually a general mobilization of society if we want to renovate old buildings that we have in Europe. What we need to do is to take essentially all buildings in Europe and we need to deeply renovate them, and I insist on deeply. A deep renovation is something that cuts energy demand by 60 to 90%. So that's not just changing windows, that's rethinking the entire architecture of the building. Currently, the renovation rate, the deep energy efficiency renovation rate of buildings in Europe is around 0.1, 0.2%. And if we want to renovate all of them by 2050, we need to get it to 3, 3.5, 4%. So we need to multiply by 20 the existing efforts. If we want to multiply by 20, this is not going to happen with just the invisible hand of the market. This happens through regulation and through also a public-private partnership that helps to organize the entire supply chain of buildings. Finally, decarbonisation of electricity and energy. And this is really looking at the entire spectrum of sources that we have. We often talk about renewable energy as this was just a single family, but I mean, those are very different kinds of energies. I counted them all. I managed to find 22 of them, and I recently discovered a 23rd. Each one of those energy sources plus nuclear have a different business case and a different, let's say, time horizon. All the stuff that required time to be deployed need to be started now. So if France indeed wants to opt for the building of new nuclear power plants, it's better to decide it now than in 10 years, because in 10 years it's going to be too late for climate. But that's obviously a national decision, and the French decision is also to be understood in the emotional but also strategic role of nuclear in France's sovereignty after World War II. So to be clear, I'm speaking about the military dimension of nuclear here, which makes France quite different from other countries. And then some renewables can be deployed very, very quickly. My pet technology is solar thermal power, which is a very old technology, has been invented in the late 19th century, has been rolled out in the 20th century. By any chance, I'm just asking you guys a question. Which country do you think in continental Europe has the greatest solar thermal capacity? So the country in Europe that produces the greatest amount of energy per person using solar thermal energy?
Portugal.
Not Portugal. Give it a try. Not Germany, no. Close to Germany, though. A bit to the south, it's Austria. Austria is not particularly sunny, Really. It's just, political choice. They made a political choice to do a modest development of solar thermal energy. As a result of that, they have the global leader in solar thermal energy system, a company called Drian. If we're really ambitious about solar thermal, we can deploy a lot of things now, before the next winter. This obviously works better in the south, but it also works in the north. There is a company in Finland producing solar thermal systems, so that also works there. And that can be helpful to save a few molecules of gas by the next winter. And obviously, if we have a genuine plan to deploy solar thermal massively with existing technologies that are fit for residential heating, but also with next technologies, future technologies that are in development today that can be used for district heating, can be used for some medium temperature industrial usage, then we can have solar thermal accounting for 5 to 10% of our total energy mix. Which incidentally might mean that solar thermal will provide a greater part of the European energy than nuclear in 2050, and yet most of the debate has been mostly on nuclear rather than solar thermal. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. Really interesting and lots of very practical tips and ideas for us to dig into in a discussion. If I may, I would like to turn now to Olivier Luanzi. From PricewaterhouseCoopers. We've heard a lot from previous speakers this morning on the role of private sector participation in finding the balance on energy, in the role of private finance in this picture, and so on. So I wanted to give you the floor to ask you what's your sense on whether you're getting what you need from governments from a private sector perspective on this at the moment. How do you see it from the other side of the fence, if you like? And if not, what you feel the current gaps are in the framework to incentivize the type of transition that Thomas has outlined for us.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I'm going to talk more about industry and production industry. One point which seems for me in the debate not put in the middle is that currently enterprise and public power, government and so on, are sharing a goal, a common goal. There is very often comments, even from the European Parliament, that the bad lobby from industry is slowing down some reforms and so on. I don't say it does not exist, but globally, I think there is a conscience that is now largely shared and on which we could build a lot of things. Unfortunately, I would say technologies and knowledge about the technologies have shifted from the 60s, 70s, from government to enterprise, private enterprise, and the governments are still considering they know technologies and their development, and they are the tendency to make some mistakes by not including private companies into their decision. I will give you a few examples because of lack of knowledge. Simply, it's not bad will, it's not a different point of view, it's not sharing a goal, but it's just they have lost competences on what the real technological and supply chain world is, and we have a tendency to making big mistakes. That's the global picture I would like to give. So, common goal, share of technologies, knowledge of technologies that have shifted from government to private enterprise, and we are not totally aligned for that. Now, in terms of concrete decisions to be made, or action plan, because that's the title of a round table. The first one in France from enterprise point of view is certainly energy. Put back the nuclear power plants running. We will be missing 100 terawatt-hours of nuclear electricity this year in France. This should be solved very quickly. This volume of nuclear electricity means if it's replaced by a shift of a mix of gas and coal electricity, is 10% additional CO2 emission for France. So you have to be prepared that the total footprint of CO2 of France by the end of 2022 might be 10% higher than the previous year. And that continue in 2023 if we don't solve that issue with our nuclear power plants very quickly. when I'm talking about CO2 emission, the consequences of that for France is that electricity is at a higher price than Germany, and then we have an issue that we never had before in terms of competitions towards Germany, for instance. The second priority, I would say, would be for the French government to shift a little bit its effort and its support. There is big money for decarbonisation of industry, and mainly focus on the sectors which are emitting the most of CO2. That's a good effort, very well, but if you take a lifetime of a product, very often the part related to production is limited towards the part related to use. And there is very little efforts to support enterprise and companies to redesign their products towards eco-conceptions. It could be for circular economy and also for carbon footprint. So basically, we have a good plan, a good support for enterprise to diminish their use of energy, to switch to carbon-free energy or lower carbon content energy. But again, this represents only 20% of the emissions. The 80% remaining will be done by changing the lifetime of the products, end of life, during the life. And this is not a tendency that the French government is supporting sufficiently toward the enterprise. If I go back to the mismatch, so that's two priorities I would put very short term. Now on midterm, I will just illustrate, and I might be a little bit provocative, two intentions which are shared and good and that might end up with catastrophe. You all heard about CO2 tax. I call it MRCF. I don't know in English how you spell it. CBAM, okay. So it has been decided, it's on raw materials. There is somehow a legal lecture of a text which has been made which is not complete. And I will give you an example very clear. If you import a block of aluminium from, let's say, Turkey, you will be taxed. If you import a transformed piece of aluminium from Turkey, you won't be taxed because the text today is not covering transformed products. And behind a good intention, which is protecting our European aluminium industry, at the end of the day, we will have people importing transformed aluminium products because they won't be taxed with a different system. And therefore, we will kill the industry we wanted to protect. This is typically one big example. I hope it will be solved before it's going to enter into force, clearly. Just to let you know, in France, there is an evaluation which is not public. And I will give you a figure, but with all the reserve. This system could cost 300,000 industrial jobs in France, 10% of industrial jobs in France. So again, the intention is shared by everyone. Governments wants to have a level playing field. Industry wants to be competitive, even if they have a carbon tax in Europe, so you have to protect on the borders. The implementation is weak because, again, in the legislative process, knowledge about the concept of supply chain is too weak. That's where we have a gap of understanding, and that's where building trust between industry and the governments, could be at European level again, or at national level, is essential to avoid such mistakes. And what I'm telling you, again, I had some discussion with at the level of Élysée, so French presidency, about it. The fact is known and recognized. I'm not inventing it again. I'm not here to step up for the industry and again this system of carbon tax at the border. This is officially known. I will give you another one which strikes me. Taxonomy. Again, in principle, it's very good. In practice, what we are doing is that we are dividing our society between the bad and the goods. And that never works. Organizing solidarity between the one that will win from decarbonisation, because that will be their business model. They will sell solution. They will have, they will sell production of low CO2 energy and so on and so on. And those who needs to transform their business model would be a better way. But we start by showing who is the good, who are the goods and the bads. As society is evolving, then you have a problem like defense sector now. When we started taxonomy, we had no war. Defense sector was in the bad part, somehow. And now we have a war, and we have plenty of PM, of small and medium enterprise, which are filling our defense industry, which cannot be financed properly. And that's a common thing a largely known effect again, this is not about carbon things, but I'm just showing you the consequences of splitting societies. Again, this is only, indications and so on. But we have to think of trying to build solidarity between the one who will win and the one who will lose before trying to build walls between them. That's, for me, a change of attitude we need, and that's the consequences of the war. And last point, we have all to understand that we're entering into an era of Cold War for decades. So how will the world be organized? How will subjects which are so important for our life, but also for our economies, be organized in a world which is split in two parts? I have no answer to that, but I just think that as a consequences of a war which has started in February, we should realize that the way we have handled global warming before, with global, I would say, agreement implemented on that, will totally change. How will the other part react to that type of subject in the next years? I have no clue, but clearly it's a game changer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I think we absolutely agree with you on the scale of the change that Russia brought, Russia's war has brought. But we nevertheless want to try to look for pathways through to ensure that that is not at the total cost of the climate agenda, which is very much the thinking around today's discussion. I'd like to go now to Lola Vallejo. Olivier has talked about the winners and the losers as part of this picture. You very much look at this question of climate at IDRI in terms of Europe's international relationships, underpinning both the energy and climate security. And I would be keen to hear from you on your sense on what should the priorities be on that front over the coming months.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank you, Susie, for this paper, because I think it's invaluable to have a kind of a mirror held up to us, and having this broad set of researchers and policymakers saying, what role they think France could play, I think is really worthy. So thank you for that really interesting work. And just, I'd like, before answering your question, to go back to a few things that you said, just because you mentioned the need to relaunch nuclear, but I just wanted to maybe highlight that about half of the power plants now are not working, mainly because of maintenance issues, if I'm correct. So even if we decided to launch more nuclear, it would be effective up and running in over a decade, if not a lot more. So just to say that in the short term, there's no way around this kind of push to renewables. It's not to say that we shouldn't also have a clear push for nuclear in the longer run, but it's more to clarify the timelines. And on the taxonomy, I think very shortly, the taxonomy for me has been a bit of a fiasco, because it had one job, which was to give a bit of a premium to what was good for the transition. And I think by meddling the waters, by including gas or giving it this kind of intermediary status, it's kind of lost the global credibility that it could have had. So that's just all I want to say on this. That's not to say that you couldn't, encourage and have mechanisms to support the dirtier parts of the economy transition. I think there's some things are already in place for that, but I just wanted to maybe highlight that. Going to your question now, Susie, I think we've talked about the trilemma. France is also in a key position to act and shift the focus in terms of what is the discussion going to be with regards to agriculture, because we also have a piece in the Fit for 55 package, or next to it actually, but as part of the Green Deal, which is the farm to fork strategy. And I think there's been also similar calls to kind of weaken the farm to fork strategy and weaken its environmental provisions, because in the face of the Russia-Ukraine war, we also need food sovereignty. So we should, not implement this farm to fork strategy. So just to say that this is a bigger debate, but I think France's position on this is also going to be critical. And simply put, at Idru, we've also looked at, but there's a clear parallel with the energy theme. If you look at long-term resilience, you have to invest in this agroecology that is set out by the farm to fork strategy, and you can't let the short-term crisis let you set back by years or even decades your environmental objectives. I think in terms of the role that also France can play more externally, France and Germany in particular have been really pushing recently the cooperation angle that has been mentioned before towards external partners. And I just wanted to have a little note of caution. At the last COP26 in Glasgow, there was a big fanfare around the Just Energy Transition Partnership launched by France, UK, Germany, the US and Europe as a whole. And it was an 8 billion partnership to kind of spur the decarbonisation of South African coal sector. And this was, it's a great partnership, but there's also a risk that we may not be fully aware of in France, that this really backfires in terms of the multilateral narrative, because it may be seen by some countries in the developing world as a divide and conquer strategy, because it's a narrative that is really owned and driven by developed countries. So effectively, if you set out which countries you want to do partnerships with, and you set out the terms and conditions, then this can be seen as something that is, in effect, counterproductive to the discussions that we have on international climate finance in COPs, just to lay it out there. It's not to say that these shouldn't go forward and that there isn't space for a more constructive narrative, but we should be really clear-minded about the potential to backfire and the need to integrate these JET partnerships, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, into the fold of the multilateral climate discussions. And so that was on the external front. Maybe just on the internal one, I think what Thomas has highlighted, the instrumentalization of climate policy to push for other political gains is very true. I think there's also an opportunity around this instrumentalization of climate objectives, because in the game of pawns that are European countries trying to agree on the way forward, the fact that there's a bigger realignment between energy security and climate objectives is also an opportunity for the Visegrad countries, so broadly speaking, Eastern European countries, which have been less forward in terms of climate policy and now see more appetite for energy efficiency and ambitious renewable policies. So these are the three comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Lola, and then I'm sure there'll be lots that we want to come back to there in the discussion. So finally, I would like to give the floor to Manuel Barrito. You're the senior economist in the Energy Projects Directorate at EIB. I'm interested if you could bring your reflections back to the European level and talk about what you feel needs to be taken forward from where we are now at the end of the French presidency in terms of the energy transition, the union between member states, particularly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. So yes, I will indeed focus my intervention more on the themes that are developed around REPower EU, the REPower EU plan. So it has been said already by VP Fayol, the EIB is the EU climate bank. Doesn't mean that we don't care about energy security. And in fact, I used to work for the IEA on energy security issues before, so I'm very well aware that we cannot have an energy transition successfully at the expense of energy security. And this is exactly what we're seeing right now. So I very much like the title of this seminar. What is happening? We used to have an energy price crisis that started in September last year, that progressively transformed itself into an energy security crisis. And now we are seeing that we are trying to fight this energy security crisis, whatever the cost, to use an expression that has been used in another context. And it costs a lot of money, because we are ready to pay a ridiculous amount of money to bring in natural gas with LNG and to divert LNG that was initially supposed to go to Asia and to bring this to Europe. And the risk is to do this in an uncoordinated and fragmented fashion in the EU. And so what the European Commission wants to do in Repower EU is, by creating this EU energy platform, for instance, is to ensure the good coordination of these actions. I think it's important to stress that there cannot be trade-off when it comes to energy security. People will not accept if the lights go out. So that's an imperative. And this will have consequences. The other topic of Repower EU is about renewables. And here when we discuss about action plan for the new French government, we already discussed energy efficiency, we discussed nuclear, but we hardly discussed renewables. But Repower EU is all about renewables in practice. So we all know the announcements that have been made by President Macron in terms of new reactors, but we are talking about what? 10 gigawatts of nuclear, maybe 22 maximum if we build 6 plus 8 new EPRs in France. This also means, if you know the RTE scenarios, that we will need in France to invest more than 100 gigawatts of renewables. So you have 10 gigawatts and 20 gigawatts of nuclear on one side, 100 gigawatts of renewables on the other side. So the investment needs in renewables in France are massive, and there is clearly a perception at EU level that France is lagging behind in terms of renewable deployment, and a big announcement on renewables would definitely be something that would help French leadership in Europe in this field. That's my personal view. I don't know if it reflects the view of the EIB, but this is what I think. What we are talking about is a target of deployment of 600 gigawatts of solar PV by 2030. We currently have 180 gigawatts, so we need to massively invest in solar PV, at least double the current rate of deployment of solar PV as of next year. So this is extremely important. And the investment needs are also huge. And of course, from an EIB perspective, we stand ready to support these investments. The third theme that I wanted to discuss are electricity prices. So we alluded to this already. The social consequences of high electricity and gas prices are huge. Here again, there is a risk of market fragmentation, I think. You mentioned the low availability of nuclear in France next winter. This is really a concern. As you know, France depends a lot on electric heating. And so there is a risk that France will need massively to import electricity during the winter period to ensure security of supply. And so we cannot do this without neighboring countries. And one of the big success of the EU energy policy is precisely the market integration and the market coupling, electricity market coupling between different countries. Of course, this has consequences. The consequence of market coupling is that prices in France are also high because they are set by gas power plants. The price is set by the cost of gas power plants in neighboring countries as well. So this issue of high prices needs to be addressed at wholesale level, but also at the retail level. France has long been very reluctant to introduce competition on the retail market, especially for smaller consumers. And this question of retail price regulation is back on the agenda. It's part of the instruments that have been identified by the Commission in the toolbox 6 months ago. And I think we will continue to discuss this question in the coming months and years. Another point is about investment. So it's funny, I was thinking about the French government has endorsed this concept of ecological planification, but in fact in Europe we have plans, we have targets, we have 2030 targets, we have several plans, we have the national energy and climate plans, we have the recovery and resilience plans, we have all kinds of plans, and so it will be interesting to see if this concept of ecological planning, not plan but planning, is gaining momentum outside Europe as well, and outside France as well. And the last point I wanted to comment on that is also coming from Repower EU is EU solar strategy. So this is linked to industry that we were discussing before. We want to reach an installed capacity of solar PV of 600 gigawatts by 2030, but we don't have a European industry for solar PV manufacturing. And so after the EU targets to develop and policy to develop batteries, now we have a policy at EU level to support the development of solar PV manufacturing in Europe, with the objective to have 20 gigawatts per year of manufacturing capacity in the EU. So just from an EIB perspective, this is something that is eligible for financing only if there is innovation associated with this manufacturing capacity. We have done this in the past for batteries with Northvolt, for instance. We could do this in principle, but only to the extent there is innovation involved in this manufacturing capacity. And just to give some order of magnitude, if you take the 10 largest solar PV manufacturers, mainly located in China, their average size is around 16 gigawatt per year of manufacturing capacity. The largest one has a target of a production capacity of 40 gigawatt per year. So what we're talking about in Europe is maybe one. There is room for one PV manufacturing company if we want to be competitive in this field. And again, we need innovation. So I just want to stop here and to have time for the panel discussion. So the key point is that I think from an energy security perspective, there is no trade-off possible. You need to keep the lights on whatever the cost. This is very important for the current crisis, but also in the coming years as we decarbonize. We cannot do this at the expense of energy security. The discussion about electricity prices will have to take place at EU level. If possible, the EU dimension is new. Also for this energy security dimension, we used to discuss energy security at country by country level. Now we are starting to discuss this at EU level, which is a major development, I think, of the last year, with many risks associated with this. And so there is a need for a strong leadership or a narrative, to take your words, to ensure that we travel to and go through this while avoiding the fragmentation of the EU market, which is a big risk in this context.
Thank you very much indeed. Really interesting comments. I want to, I've seen some body language indicating disagreement between the speakers at various points, so I want to give you all a chance to react to each other, because it's great that we have the different perspectives represented around the table. I also want to throw into the mix, though, a question around the possibility of a just energy transition, because obviously a key part of keeping decarbonisation on course is keeping public opinion in Europe on course for this element of the energy question. And you know, on the one hand, we've heard on the need for individuals to make sacrifices within that. On the other hand, we've had a comment recently in a tribune from the chief executive of Total, sort of calling for greater consumer restraint on this front too. On the other hand, as we saw in the research I was referring to earlier, there's also a sense that in some member states we're getting that balance wrong, and there's too much of a focus on the consumer and the consumer role within this, and not a sufficient role on industry. Not sufficient focus on industry's role within that. So I'd be keen to hear from any of the panelists, what's your perspective on how we manage that balance? Is there a way we can do it? Because ultimately these are all partners that we need to take with us. Are there any other questions from the floor that people want to throw in for panelists? Or if not, I will send them off for another round on that. Yes, please. I think I've got your microphone, maybe. Oh no, Jenny's getting on. It's coming behind you, sorry. Just so that they can hear online as well.
Okay. So thank you all of you for this very interesting presentation. I had a question maybe for Manuel Barrito, and I'm sure that others can complete. You said that we cannot do the energy transition at the expense of energy sovereignty. Security, yeah, thank you. And I was wondering, what is your view about the fact that when we will switch to renewables, we will create new dependencies? So you mentioned that for solar PV manufacturing, we have this IPC in Europe, but what about maybe the raw materials behind it? How can we compare the magnitude of the new dependencies that we're creating against the dependencies that we are substituting? So I guess that it is less critical, maybe, to be dependent on some raw materials from China or other countries to manufacture the PV solar panels than to be dependent of Russian oil and gas. But how do we compare them? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Any other questions? Yes, Varma at the front.
Hi. Hello. All right. So yeah, a related question. One was just looking specifically at Russia in this context, given its importance in critical raw materials. So high percentages of global palladium, quite a significant in platinum, titanium, vanadium, all of which are on the EU's at least existing critical raw materials list to be updated sometime next year. And it's the third global supplier of nickel, which is going to be important. So there's one question about Russia's specific impact on Europe's ability to transition, whether or not this changes timelines, what this means for new investments given ESG demands and so on, for sourcing the critical raw materials. And then in a related question to that, this idea that's come up several times about the potential rise of kind of green petrostates, this idea that where you have outside deposits of critical raw materials, that these are going to be make or break countries globally, and what lessons we could draw from when oil was a currency in the 70s, and what this could mean going forward. What are the kinds of standards that Europe is willing to put in place to work with and develop these countries to play an outsized economic role? Congo is always a very interesting example, but there's others, Zimbabwe, Guinea. I'm thinking specifically of Africa here, but Chile, others are very important globally as well. So two-part question, one specifically on the role of Russia and its impact in critical raw materials, but then also the future partnerships. What kind of states are we looking at in terms of governance models, and what does that really mean for Europe's ability to pick and choose, if at all, its ability? And then, if I may, a third is what this now means for industry. A lot of companies are worried about in the short term at least, the impact of sanctions, but then the kind of secondary impact of sanctions if they're getting involved in very complicated supply chains.
Thank you very much indeed. So that's four very interesting questions to add into mine. Who would like to go first in terms of comments? Thank you.
Let's de-zoom a bit. So our energy system has been built after decades and centuries of political and socio-technical choices. This system today, what does it bring us? It does bring us definitely a lot of amounts of energy that we can waste, some of it being very useful, significant part of it being wasted, including through air conditioning when it's not necessary. But just the idea of moving a human being that weighs anything between 50 and 100 kilograms in a box of steel that is 1,800 kilograms is also a waste. It also brought us the greatest degree of pollution ever created in humankind that threatens to lead to the collapse of our civilization in this century, climate change. Brought us air pollution that kills around 7 million people every year, which is, I think, in COVID, almost the amount of people that died out of COVID, more or less. By the way, air pollution, those are premature death. So if you die of air pollution at age 85, you're not counted in that number statistically. And this also brought a lot of power to a lot of people that own fossil fuels. The second war on Ukraine, and the first war on Ukraine also that started in 2014, is a hydrocarbon war in the sense that it has been funded by hydrocarbons. Without the money that Putin had with oil and gas, the Russian army would not have had the equipment and the manpower to think that they could quickly win this war. And finally, this brings inflation to us Europeans. We import energy, we rely on that, and this brings inflationary shocks. 1973, 1979, 2008, and now 2021. Who's to blame for all of this? This is not the renewables or the energy efficiency. Those are the consequences of the fossil fuel system. And I'm a bit tired of we work under the implicit assumption that the fossil fuel system is great, with the exception of the environment. No, for us Europeans, it's geopolitically tragic. For people who die as a result of pollution, that's literally life-threatening. So we should be clear here about who is the adversary. The adversary are the fossil fuel powers. Those are people and companies. Some of them, sometimes the way you deal with an adversary, I'm saying that as a former military, sometimes the way you deal with an adversary is you bring him to your side. That's what the Americans did in Iraq in the late noughties, early 2010s. They actually paid people that were, threatening US soldiers, bring them to their side to fight ISIS quite successfully. Some of the companies are companies that we need to bring to our side. Some of them already are, some not yet. But some of those are going to fight until the bitter end. Why on earth would Vladimir Putin support the clean energy transition that is threatening the entire basis of the economy that he has chosen for Russia? And so to me, we need to be very, very clear about that. Second, when it comes to critical materials, obviously that creates a dependency, but here we need to be very granular. You mentioned palladium. Palladium is used mostly for internal combustion engine vehicles. So when we shift towards electric vehicles, we do increase our demand for lithium, but we do decrease our demand for palladium. We also, with non-cobalt-based batteries, decrease our need for cobalt, because around 7% of the cobalt in the world is used to refine oil products. And this is virtually never mentioned. I only hear about critical materials when it comes to criticizing clean energy solutions, never when it comes to being mindful of the need of those specific critical materials for some fossil fuel technologies. One thing there also, it's a very different kind of dependency. Vladimir Putin is cutting us gas supply now. We already see electricity prices through the roof. We see gas prices through the roof. And we will very much likely have power cuts in France this winter. The sentence was said, you need to keep the lights on whatever the cost. I'm laughing at that because, we're going to see in the winter that some lights will not be kept on because the cost will simply be too high for that, and there won't be the physical capacity to produce enough electricity, especially if the winter is cold and gas is lacking. So you see that Putin does not even need to shut off gas entirely. Just reducing a bit is enough to provoke an increase in gas and electricity prices since last September, and in further decrease in the remaining weeks, worsening the situation. let's just think now, just say that, I don't know, China colonizes the entire Congo area and we don't have any more cobalt. What happens in the next weeks? Electricity prices don't change. There is an inertia of the system that is enough. Once your electric car has lithium that has been used to make its battery, if you don't have any more lithium supply, that's not a problem for the electric cars that are running. Obviously, that's a problem for the new ones that you will need to build. But that's something that geopolitically is a totally different time horizon. We're talking in a problem that will materialize in years rather than with the fossil fuel dependence, a problem that materializes in days through the price system and in weeks and months through the shortage of quantity. One country to work with specifically is Chile, obviously, for us Europeans. Chile, in my view, is the Saudi Arabia of the green transition. They have wind in the north with the democracy. They have wind in the south. They have sun in the north. They have skilled labor. They've got lithium. They've got copper. They've got free trade agreements. They've got rule of law. They've got everything to be our best partners. But by the way, they're also the biggest provider of lithium globally, far more than China, so they're far more important for that space. A word on just transition. The massive priority here is to prepare the next winter. One way to do that, or at least one country that we should look at and take inspiration from, is what Japan did after Fukushima. In 2011, they had a massive problem with electricity supply because of the Fukushima Daiichi incident. They shut down nuclear power plants then, and they needed to do something. And what they did was one of the greatest national energy-saving campaigns in human history. It's called the Setsuden. It's literally a campaign to save energy. They did that nationally. They managed to reduce electricity demand by 15%, 1.5, and peak demand, which is really what matters for the stability of the grid, by 20%. That's massive. Like, if in France we manage to reduce peak demand by 20%, we're good for the winter. Like, even with a weak nuclear fleet, even with limited to no Russian gas. But obviously, to do that, this here again, does not come from just information campaign. It's a general mobilization of society, and it requires everybody to be on board. And let me be clear: when it comes to households, those who need to make a sacrifice, not really a sacrifice actually, because they are the wealthy people. They just need to redefine the definition of comfort. The bottom half of the population is already. Has already reached the 2030 climate targets, if you want to use that as a metric. Is the upper half of the population that is the one that consumes the greatest amount of energy, and those are the ones that obviously where the greatest effort and the greatest benefit can come from. But that obviously requires, here again, general mobilization first, informing people, building locally support for those kind of campaigns, creating goodwill. But in the end, you need, just like with a COVID mask, for instance, you need to have the let's say the stick of the state that needs to be ready to make sure that the people that don't want change actually do that when it's a matter of national security, and it is definitely a matter of national security for France and Europe now.
Up the line, Lola, I'm interested to hear from you on any of the aspects that you wanted to pick up on, particularly the supply chain questions and the new relationships around this picture, because clearly, as Thomas said, that some of these are longer term issues, but if we've learned one thing from the Russia's war, I hope that is at least that we need to plan a bit more long term in terms of the external relations that underpin the picture. So.
Thanks. I think I'll just pick up to what Ambroise Payot said just before, because this issue of avoiding to replace our current dependency with another is already on the EU's radar, and there are already strategy about strategic autonomy, and I'm sure Emmanuel Barreto will be able to say a bit more on that. So this is already in EU's radar, and we're already thinking about even starting mining in some places already in Europe. And that's a really tough question, because mining is obviously a very polluting industry, even if it's done less polluting manner than in the worst case scenarios. So that's one of the tensions you have between being environmentally friendly and doing some activities which pollute locally. But I think it's one that we have to tackle head first. And maybe I'd like to go, because I think Thomas has said tons of things on this kind of critical materials bubble, and also being clear-minded about the scale of the problem. I'd like to maybe go back more on the just transition question, because I think it's really important to emphasize that we can't put the onus just on consumers, just because they might lack information and frameworks and systems in place to show them the way forward. I think right now, because we have a very generous subsidy in France to kind of avoid the worst effects of the gas and the oil crisis, but it's also done in a way that has no targeting of the most vulnerable. So it's a very costly policy, and there's no incentive whatsoever to reduce your consumption, even when there could be alternatives for doing so. And I think a way forward will also be to, you mentioned the kind of discourse of honesty, so saying we'll have to make efforts, but I think also targeting who you are asking to make efforts and making sure that you encourage and support people who need it the most is going to be key. And in going back to what we mentioned before, the companies need a clear roadmap and plans. I think in France, like in Europe, we have already tons of plans and objectives. What we lack is sometimes the sectoral plans on what we actually mean by those longer-term targets or even 10-year forward targets. For instance, in the building sector, Thomas hinted on it, but we need deep renovations. And right now we don't even have a common definition on what are deep renovations. So if you can't even agree on what are really energy efficient buildings, and you can't give a clear signal to the building sector, then how do you expect companies to start planning and getting in shape for the huge renovation momentum that we say we want and we say we need? So I think that's going to be a really clear test, for instance, of the current administration in France, which puts ecological planning at the top. And I think one of the key tests will be what we do with energy renovation of buildings, and also to what extent we can deploy low carbon energy sources, including heat pumps. We have never mentioned heat pumps. I think in many cases they would be a very interesting source, and now is the time to kind of deploy a massive strategy, almost like a Marshall Plan, to reduce our consumptions, not just in the short terms through consumer campaigns, as was hinted by Thomas, but also through the medium term by planning large-scale deployment of sufficiency and low-carbon solutions.
Thank you very much indeed. Olivier Luenzi, be interested to hear your point of view from overview of the impact on industry on this balance question.
Yeah. First point, just to clarify about the nuclear power plants, because indeed, if we need new nuclear power plants, it will take decades. I was mentioning having, as you mentioned, the half of the power plants which are offline today back online, and it should be something for few years if technicalities could be solved, not at the stake of safety for sure, but to have back the full online, the existing one. I close the bracket. One point which is interesting in our discussion is the balance between sovereignty and climate change, as we mentioned. Clearly, I mean, there is some short-term issues, there is some long-term issues with the raw materials, for instance. That's what I was mentioning with a Cold War world, knowing where those sources could be. And clearly here we have decisions to be made collectively, and it won't be a decision to be made at the level of one member state, but all together. How you balance those two? What type of solution do you allow yourself? For instance, a very concrete one, do you reopen lithium mining in Europe, for instance? I mean, that's a classical one that you have read everywhere, but that type of question will be raised again. And we have absolutely no space where this type of balance of interest are being discussed properly today. If you look to newspapers, this is pro and against. And today, the agenda of Europe is very much centered, it was past also, we will see it might move, on decarbonisation. The sovereignty issue is new and weak. even if you say this is in the radar, this is new, and again, the alignment of member states is far away from what it is on environment and decarbonization. So between those two interests of a region, of a continent, how we're going to balance that, this is a long-term issue we haven't yet started. Short-term issue, for sure, winter, and you mentioned the need of a market, European market, but if I'm right, Spain and Portugal are already out, decoupled from the market.
No, not exactly, no.
From the price point of view, it is.
Spain is exporting electricity to France as we speak, for instance.
Yes, physically, yes, but from the price point of view, they are not, I mean, the price system is not working on the whole market anymore.
No,
it is
congestions because of the lack of interconnection capacity between Spain and France. And the other thing is that Spain has introduced a cap on the price of gas used for power generation, compensating the difference between the market price and the price cap that was set to operators. And this leads, in fact, to a start of market fragmentation in the sense that the price is not the same across Europe. So
Yes.
This may lead to more increase in exports of power from Spain to France. Given the fact that there is spare LNG import capacity in Spain, maybe it's not that bad thing. Yeah, it's a bit technical. Yeah, sorry.
The point, okay, on the technicalities, I would let you guys, but the fact is that with this decoupling or partial decoupling, at least on price, not physical, you have also a question about the competition within Europe which could start about production. Again, this is the beginning, but we have to be careful about it because, as we said, you need to have united answers. And if you start to fragment the market, electricity market, energy market, or even the market itself, because energy is a good part of cost in production, then you might have tensions and issues which I start to feel. That's a message I want to pass.
Thank you very much indeed. Just on the sovereignty point, I can't resist and balancing sovereignty with the climate agenda. I can't resist a little plug for a product that we launched from ECFR last week, which is called the Sovereignty Index, where we've tried to measure Europe's sovereignty in different areas. And as part of that process, we've actually identified what we think of as climate sovereignty. So this is the ability to pursue our climate goals in an interconnected world and exactly sort of how we manage these relationships. And I think it's increasingly important that we think in those terms when we're thinking about sovereignty, as well as the sort of the pure security sense. But yeah, anyway. It's not my turn, so I'm going to now give the last word to Manuel Barreto. You had a specific question addressed to you, which others have also thought about on supply chains, but please feel free to...
Thank you. I will give specific answers in interest of time. On the just transition question, I would like to stress that a lot has been done at EU level already. The EU has set up a just transition fund that the EIB is partly managing, by the way, a modernization fund and the EIB is also playing a role in this modernization fund. There is a recovery and resilience fund, which also is used to and leveraged to allocate more funding to, let's say, countries that need to invest more in because of the energy transition. And so if you look at, there was a very interesting analysis made by Agora Energiewende on this, comparing the investment needs in different EU countries in terms of percentage of GDP for the energy transition and the funds from these different instruments that have been allocated to these countries. And you see that the extra effort is needed is already to some extent compensated by this mechanism. So a lot has been done already when it comes to the just transition within the EU. And now, of course, with high electricity and gas prices, the issue is shifting. So it's not called just transition, strictly speaking, but this question of affordability and cost of energy more generally is becoming much more general. The second point I would like to make is about the dependency. So energy security has many dimensions. We mainly discussed the fuel security dimension, the lack of gas. So we discussed also the resource adequacy dimension. Will we have enough capacity to meet peak demand next winter in France? And there is also this industrial dimension that you were alluding to. Just to be factual, so this is not a new topic. The Commission and Europe has identified critical raw materials as an issue a long time ago. Back in 2019, when the EIB has approved its new energy lending policy, you may have heard about it, the Commission asked explicitly to include critical raw material as eligible for EIB financing. So the EIB can finance such projects. And we are starting to look at projects of lithium in Europe, indeed, at the moment. This is happening. Outside Europe, of course, we also have very high standards in terms of environmental and social standards. So we have many, many standards. Basically, this means that outside the EU, we apply and we have the same standards than within the EU when it comes to social and environmental issues. And so, of course, when we talk about developing new mines outside the EU, you have to make sure that you meet these standards, which is a very important dimension for the bank.
Thank you very much indeed, both to you, Manuel, for those comments, and to all four of you for a really interesting discussion. I think we're really grateful for the way in which you've engaged with the issues and disagreed with each other, and it's shown, you know, just how much there is to do in terms of finding the right pathways through all of this, but lots of really concrete ideas as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to now give the table, finally relinquish the table, and pass over for closing remarks to the heads of the Paris and Berlin offices of the EIB, Grégoire, Chauvière, Drian, and Heike Freimuth.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's just for today the Berlin office. We have jointly organized with ECFR this event here today, which shows really, and as Susie mentioned in the beginning, it couldn't be more timely as today energy ministers are meeting in Luxembourg actually, and Commissioner Simpson actually ahead of this council meeting said in light of the security of supply risk caused by Russia's continued weaponization of energy, we need to step up our preparedness in a coordinated way and push forward all the pillars of our Repower EU plan. Diversification, green energy and energy savings. This Energy Council is a key moment to do so by moving forward with our legislative work on renewables, energy efficiency and gas storage. So I think we had, in that sense, a very, very interesting discussion today, which showed the complexity of the questions which the ministers should discuss today and find solutions, hopefully, to that. And it seems like, in terms of complexity, there is not only about technical solutions, about the financing to be mobilized, which of course EIB is key to contribute as an EU actor in that. But also in terms of dependencies we have in international supply chain. We were talking about creating, actually moving from one dependency to another, by focusing more on solar where a new dependency pops up. So yeah, I think the discussion was very, very interesting. Thank you very much to ECFR, also for the report, which comes at a right juncture. And we will be very curious to see what our ministers come up here today. In order to move forward in that aspect. Thank you very much for your attention, for your participation in the debate, and let's meet again to discuss further. Thank you.